There's a story that gets told about elephants. A matriarch is dying. She's been weakening for days. The herd doesn't leave. They stay close, touch her with their trunks, press against her body. When she finally goes still, something happens that researchers have documented across multiple field studies on multiple continents. The other elephants don't move on immediately. They stand over the body. Some of them return to it days later. They touch the bones with their feet and their trunks. Even months after, even years after, even when the elephant who died was no longer recognizable as anything more than scattered remains. You can call that instinct. You can call it confusion. But the more you look at the data across species, the harder it becomes to explain away. The question of whether animals know when they're dying is not a simple one, and the answer is not a single, clean yes or no. It splits into two separate questions that people tend to collapse into one. Do animals recognize death in others, and do they recognize it in themselves? The evidence for the first one is extensive. The evidence for the second one is stranger and harder to interpret, and that's where it gets interesting. Let's start with what's documented. Chimpanzees in the wild have been observed carrying the bodies of their dead infants for days, sometimes weeks. A study published in the Royal Society Open Science tracked this behavior across multiple populations in Africa and found it happening consistently across sites, across decades. Mothers grooming infants that had been dead for days, carrying them, returning to them. The behavior only stopped gradually, not all at once, as if something was being processed, not just abandoned. Crows hold vigils. This is not metaphor. Wildlife biologist Kaylee Swift spent years studying what happens when a crow encounters a dead crow. What she found is that crows will stop, gather, call out, and in many cases avoid the area where the death occurred for an extended period afterward. They don't just note the body and move on. They treat it as significant information. They update their behavior in response to it. The location becomes associated with danger, and that association persists. Dolphins have been observed supporting the bodies of dead calves at the surface of the water, the same behavior they use to help a struggling animal breathe. They keep doing it after death. Researchers at Lisbon University documented a bottlenose dolphin doing this for at least 8 days. Geese that lose a partner show measurable physiological changes: heart rate elevation, increased stress hormones, behavioral withdrawal. The same grief signature you'd find in a mammal that's just lost something it depended on. None of this proves that these animals have a concept of death the way a human does. A concept of death, in the philosophical sense, means understanding that death is universal, that it's inevitable, that it will happen to you. That's a cognitive load that requires a certain kind of self-awareness. But the behaviors are real, and they demand some kind of explanation. Here's what the research points toward. Animals appear to recognize the absence of life in something that was alive. The body looks different. It smells different. It doesn't respond. For highly social species, something else disappears too. The behavioral signals that mean a specific individual is present. The calls, the movements, the responses. When those stop permanently, something registers. Whether that registration constitutes grief, understanding, or something in between is a question science hasn't fully closed. The harder question is the one about self-awareness. Do animals know when they're dying? There's anecdotal evidence that's been documented often enough to take seriously. Dogs that withdraw from their families in the final days and find a quiet place to lie down. Cats that stop eating and stop seeking contact. Elephants that separate from the herd when they're near death, sometimes traveling to places where other elephants have died before. These observations have been reported by researchers, veterinarians, and wildlife workers consistently enough that dismissing all of them requires more effort than it might seem. In 2019, researchers studying chimpanzees at a sanctuary in Zambia published a detailed account of the death of an elderly female named Noiki. In her final hours, the chimps around her behaved differently. They groomed her more. They stayed close. Some of them seemed to test her responsiveness repeatedly, touching her, watching for reaction. When she died, there was a period of stillness before the group moved away. One young chimp sat beside the body for an extended time, not interacting with it, just present. The researchers were careful about their language. They didn't claim the chimps knew she was dying, but they noted the behavior was distinct from normal and distinct from the responses they documented when a chimp simply fell asleep. What might actually be happening in cases like that comes down to what dying bodies signal. A dying animal's physiology changes, breathing patterns shift, body temperature drops, hormones alter the chemical signature the animal puts out. The same sensitivity that lets a trained dog smell the early markers of a seizure or detect cancer in tissue samples with documented accuracy would also allow them to detect the physiological profile of an animal in the final stages of life. They may not have a word for it or a concept to attach to it, but they may be reading the signal clearly. For the animal that is dying, the question is different. Self-awareness at the level required to understand your own mortality is rare even among mammals. Mirrors tests, one benchmark for self-recognition, have been passed reliably by great apes, dolphins, elephants, and some corvids. That's a short list. But recognizing your own reflection and understanding your own death are not the same thing. Even among humans, the full weight of mortality as a concept develops slowly through childhood and is processed differently across cultures and individuals across a lifetime. What animals may have is something more immediate. A body that is failing sends signals: pain, exhaustion, the withdrawal of energy from non-essential functions. Whether an animal interprets those signals as "this is the end" or simply responds to them by becoming still, by ceasing to seek food, by finding somewhere quiet, may be a distinction that doesn't mean much from the outside. The behavior looks the same either way, and maybe that's the honest place to land. The question, do animals know when they're dying, assumes that knowing requires the cognitive architecture we use when we think about death. But if knowing means responding to what the body is doing, adjusting behavior in a way consistent with what's actually happening, then the answer across a remarkable range of species appears to be yes. They know something, they respond to it. They act differently around death than they do around everything else. The elephants that return to the bones years later aren't doing it randomly. Something in them marks those remains as worth returning to, worth touching, worth pausing for. We don't have a word for what that is, but the absence of our word for it doesn't mean it isn't there.